right into our program here. We have our very own secretary on the Gov Board, Sasha Hoyt. Sasha is going to say a few words to you about her experience at Highland Plantation. So Sasha, thank you so much for being here. Give her a round of applause.
Okay, so hi. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sasha, as Professor Plascon just said. I was the summer 2016 Institute for Public History intern at Highland. So part of what I was doing there was giving tours of James Monroe's historic home 2 days a week. I had to create an outline of the tour and memorize it, and then tell people about the property and what happened there and stuff. I also did some research projects. One on Monroe's 1817 tour through the northern and northeastern states, and then also on a really cool artifact that we were sent by someone in Culpeper. It's a doll that has Monroe relations, so I was working on those things. So you as first years can apply to be interns through the Institute for Public History. It's a UVA thing. You apply, I think, through the English department or something, and you get a lot of really cool opportunities to work with either historic sites or museums in Charlottesville or just around Virginia, and there was one place, I think, in South Carolina too. Just so if you're interested in history or majoring in history, I'm not majoring in history, so this is more of an interest thing for me, then I really encourage you to apply. It was a very nice time that I spent there. Sara BonHarper and Nancy Stetz are both very excellent women, and I was very happy working with them there over the summer. So if you're interested, apply. So that's me.
Have any questions that you'd like to ask her about working at Highland Plantation? She does have to go because she does have another appointment, so I know she's going to be taking off her mic in a little bit, but are you able to take a question or two if anybody has a question?
Yeah. Well, that makes it easier for me.
All right, excellent. If a question does come up at some point, you know where to find her, right? Very good. So I know you need to stay here. Joe, Sue, if you can walk with them to get that parking permit and bring it back, that would be really terrific. Thank you. All right. I really appreciate it. We will see you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So are you wired for sound yet? So let me introduce Nancy Stetz.
Okay.
Nancy is the education programmer.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, correct, yeah.
You may need to expand on her title.
Sure,
Right?
yeah.
We have worked really closely with Nancy at Highland Plantation. We have had tours to Highland. We have been able to have Brown College students be involved with different events. We haven't made our plans yet for this academic year, but it's still early, even though it's September 23rd. It's still early for us to make some plans. So I'm thinking we'll be talking to you about some of the programming that they do and the things and activities, and then we'll turn this over to Dr. Sara BonHarper, who will talk with you about the plantation itself.
All right, well, thank you so much for having us this afternoon. As Stephen said, I'm Nancy Stetz. I'm in charge of education programming at James Monroe's Highland, and that encompasses hiring and training guides to give both adult and school programs, any type of lectures we do or family activities. It's a nice broad width of different ages we do programming for, plus working with great people like Sasha, who are interns in the summer. But in terms of how I got into this field, I first started in college thinking I wanted to go into teaching, and I think maybe partially because I didn't really know what other options were out there. And I found myself in classes, as you come up with lesson plans and different things, feeling kind of frustrated by the constraints of the classroom, and realized that maybe a better fit for me would be to be on site somewhere. And I'd always been just a bona fide history geek through visits to Williamsburg and different things like that growing up. And so I started looking into what options were out there and found there was this field called public history. And by pursuing that, I could get my feet wet in museums, historic preservation, archives. And I found that I really liked historic houses because they've got that great power of place. Even though a museum has the stuff, it's not the same as being on site. And so pursued working at historic houses. And so I've been at Highland for, I guess it'll be 3 years in January coming up. And so it's been a really interesting 3 years, as Sara will further elaborate on, as she's led us in decoding the message of the property. But I would love to invite you to be involved at Highland. We do have volunteer opportunities throughout the year. I'll be emailing Professor Plaskin about things that you can do to get involved. And of course, if you're interested in our internship program, happy to talk more about that later. But we love the connection between Monroe Hill and Highland. In fact, it's now part of our guide training each spring for our new hires to come to Monroe Hill and get to see where he lived while on his first farm here in Charlottesville. So, but any questions before I turn it over to Sara? Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much.
How's that? Can you hear me all right? Is that good? All right. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I thought I would follow the format and tell you a little bit about how I got where I am, which is as executive director at James Monroe's Highland, this house museum. I'm an archaeologist. Anybody here participated in archaeology ever? One? Okay, great. Are you willing to say where?
When I was in Israel, we went on an archaeological day.
Oh, very nice. Yeah. Well, like my colleague Nancy, I grew up also being very interested in history. I loved going to Colonial Williamsburg. I fell in love with understanding the physical remains of the past, going to places like Mesa Verde in Colorado. And I went then to the University of Arizona to study physical anthropology. While I was there, I ended up excavating both in the desert in Arizona and on a sunflower-covered hilltop in Umbria, Italy, where I had a revelation that that was in fact what I wanted to do with my life, and became an archaeologist. I ended up with a double major in anthropology and classics. I have a PhD in anthropology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I worked locally at Monticello for a good long time. That was what brought me to Charlottesville as the research manager in the archaeology department there. Was there for a good long while and looking for my next challenge, really saying, okay, what am I going to do next? Let's think of the next bigger picture. And that's why I moved around the hillside over to Highland about 4 years ago. 4 years and 1 week, I think, by my counting. So that's what I'm doing there, and that's my career trajectory and what got me where I am. So I'd like to spend maybe about half an hour talking about the core of our research and presentation at Highland, the real essence of what we're doing there. Okay, so anybody been to Highland, formerly known as Ashland Highland? So we got one. Oh, we have some. Yeah, yeah.
October's the month.
All right. Well, we will fix that. Right. It is the smaller of the two presidential homes locally, and has a whole lot to offer. I hope we'll show. The aerial here shows you the historic main house here, the 1870s Massey House, a row of dependencies there. And the area that we'll be talking about where we have made a big and startling archaeological discovery is here. And let's look. All right, James Monroe. I'm not even going to ask for a show of hands. You want to shout out Monroe's accomplishments. 5th President of the United States, what is he known for? Yep, absolutely. Okay. Very good. Era of good feelings, yep. Did I hear a third? I love it when I can get a top 3. I know you can. If you know the era of good feelings, I'm sure you know another. 1812. What did he do during the War of 1812? Sorry, that wasn't. You get a pass because you already said. He was Secretary of State and then simultaneously Secretary of War. Okay, great, good. So we have some good Monroe knowledge going on here. That's very nice. He is a little bit in the shadows. Jefferson does kind of dominate the landscape here in a lot of ways. And one of my jobs is to make Monroe better understood. And I have been working on that with able collaboration, on making a relevant message about Monroe that's also as accurate as it can possibly be. And making it compelling. And really one of my goals is making it compelling for new and different audiences, for people of certain generations who don't necessarily frequent historic house museums, especially, okay? So at this site, like Monroe being a little bit overshadowed sometimes, the house itself, the historic Monroe period house, has often been overshadowed by this larger 1870s house here that masks it from view when you think you're in a front yard. Really what has been known as the Monroe house for a long time is this smaller white house kind of hidden behind the shoulder of that yellow house. And that was had a long history. It was said for a long time to be the 1799 main house that James Monroe and his family moved into once they vacated Monroe Hill here. And the documentary evidence pointed us in the direction of that little house, that remaining piece, being the smaller of two wings of a two-wing structure. These two architectural masses here, the smaller wing and the larger, they sort of flip-flop in position. There's a little bit of inaccuracy, or probably it didn't really matter too much for an insurance document. Really what they were insuring against was fire. And so what mattered was the material that it was made out of, whether it was brick or wood or stone, for example, and how close any other buildings were. All right, that's really what mattered. It didn't really matter the form as much. So we see in 3 different years, Monroe took out insurance policies on the house with descriptions here. You can see the basic language shows that we're still talking about the same building in each of these 3 phases. I'm going to go a little bit light on some of the actual nitty-gritty details so that we can get to some of the questions at the end and see really what you would like most to talk about. So we'll just sort of go past this a little bit. And so here we are thinking that we have the smaller of 2 wings of the Monroe house. And there's this newspaper article that we found within the past year or so. It says the main building is new. That's that yellow house, that 1870s house. The old Monroe house having been nearly destroyed by fire. Okay, so this is a point here about 130 years ago that says what we have here is a piece of Monroe's main house. And so it's established long since that this is what we've got. And this is what had been interpreted here for a long time. And what I presume later owners had thought. The property was occupied for almost all of its history. And it was in private ownership until 1974 when the last private owner of it died and bequeathed the estate to the College of William and Mary. Why on earth the College of William and Mary, say we, standing here on grounds? Anybody want to guess? He did go there. Woohoo! Yeah, good job. You're getting lots of good answers today. Yes, he was a William and Mary alumnus. He studied there for about 2 years and actually was swept off into the American Revolution and did not complete his studies there. William and Mary embraces him nonetheless as an alumnus and a person having gone on to do great things since studying there. All right, so here's what we've got from the south side, again, to orient you, that later house, that new main house. Remember in 1885 they said this portion here that was said for a long time to be Monroe's main house. When the college inherited the property in 1974, it embarked on several different kinds of research, one of which was archaeology. It also did some architectural history involving the documents and the materials, and it also did some biographical work and information from the letters. All of them said, yep, what you got is a portion of that main house. So lots of, went through the checklist, said, is this what we think we have? And they said, yeah, it was. The archaeology, however, did point out, here's that white part of the house, the yellow part of the house, right? This yard that we're going to talk about. Every archaeological report that I have ever read or written says, these are our results, and here are recommendations for future research. Okay, every single one. And this one from the mid-1970s was no different. And it said you should excavate up here, north of the house, here up on this knoll. This is the highest point of the property, right around in here, and here northeast, just off the northeast corner in this particular yard. So that was sort of, what is that, 40 years ago now? And that didn't ever quite happen. And so when I got there and started asking questions about the house and say, okay, how do we know such and such? How do we know what we're saying about the house? I picked up that report and said, maybe we should start excavating around and have a look. And the main point was that with this portion that we assumed to be that smaller section, we didn't know whether that larger section would be here or here, okay? And the attempts to define that were left a little bit ambiguous. We didn't really know, and so that's why they said dig in these places. And if you remember with the flip-flopping of the orientation of the two masses of the house, we really didn't know. So I thought it was pretty important to say, we gotta know for sure. And so what do? We started digging, right? Dug shovel test pits, small round holes in the ground, just down as far as undisturbed soil, and screened for artifacts that way, looking for more information. Dug all the way around, 360 around that main house. And it was in the front, in that yard that I've pointed to, amid the boxwoods, that we found a really major clue. And this is a picture of a stone that we later determined to be part of a stone foundation. It's hard to tell while it's just exposed in this little format. But we also found a great pile of other architectural debris, including glass, nails, brick, some small interior, domestic interior objects, things like furniture tacks and ceramics, things that are more and less common, less and more common respectively. But this was pretty unusual. And so we set out to dig more. And we really wanted to know the architectural debris that we found in that yard. Did it come from a building that stood on that spot, or was it pushed from somewhere else? All right, now in all kinds of research, whether it's in chemistry or archaeology or what have you, what you're setting out is to answer specific questions, right? You go along, you might have broad questions, but then your next steps are guided by specific questions, and that was one here. Was the building here or was it elsewhere? Okay, and we found out that the building was there. This slide shows evidence of burned, what may be floor planks right there. And this shows a chimney base, sort of the below the floor support for a chimney stack. Okay, and so we were able to say at the end of this excavation season in 2015 that yes, absolutely, the building was there. Okay, so in a yes/no question, we got a solid answer. Okay. At the same time, we were having a good architectural look at the house. Brought in some of the best and most established architectural historians in Virginia. These gentlemen are from Colonial Williamsburg, and they started looking at the fabrics and finishes, the patterns that they could find in the house. And it wasn't one or two pieces that caught their attention, it was a whole series. And eventually they came back and said, it looks like this house was built in the first quarter of the 19th century. So by my reckoning, that's 1800 to 1825, right? And when Monroe moved in 1799, that's cutting it a little close. And maybe you could have one early example of, say, brick patterns or moldings on woodwork. But to have a whole set of them being too late really roused our attention. And so they recommended, and we adopted, a plan for dendrochronology. Anybody want a dendrochronology? I'm waiting for the Greek scholars. Dendrochronology. Tree ring dating. Yep. So dating by trees and specifically tree rings. And we'll explain the method in just in a little bit of detail here in a second. But we basically pulled out samples, core samples from a bark edge. This becomes important when I talk about the sample. So this was the exterior surface of a tree at one point, and the expert is trying to drill directly into that to also pierce the very center point of that beam. Okay, that's kind of how it works. He operates on the assumption that a tree puts on a ring of growth every year, which I'm sure you're familiar with. In bounteous years, full of rain and sunshine and right conditions, a tree puts on a fat ring. In lean years, it puts on a skinny ring. In periods of drought, you'll see extended, a sequence of skinny rings, so that every region has a pattern for each species. And there's a couple species that are sort of key for each region. And so he measures these ring widths under a microscope down to some terribly precise degree, and then graphs that data. So if you've got thick, thin, thick, thick, thin, thin, thick, thin, so forth, that'll make a little spiky graph, right, with the ring widths. And what you do is you take your own little spiky graph from your house, from your beam, right there, and you match it up with, that's your spiky graph, and you match it up with the sequence for that region, for that particular species, all right? And so there's only really one place that it will fit statistically very well. And that gives you your date. And this isn't an approximate date. Usually if you have a good bark edge and your sample is good and your sequence is good for the region, you're not going to get maybe this decade. You're going to get something that says year and season. And we did. We actually got a date from the rafters that said that this main house was built in 1818. And for a 1799 move-in day, I have trouble with that. And so what did we do? We sat down and said, okay, could this be wrong? Could it be a mistake? Could the roof have been rebuilt? I can think of a couple times when you need to have a roof rebuilt. Hurricanes, right? Or fires, but not the whole building replaced. So let's think about how we can really rule against that and make sure that we're not promoting a mistake here. And so we actually popped off some siding from here and pulled a sample from the corner post. And the corner post architecturally is a pretty integral member of a building's structure. And so I couldn't really imagine that being replaced. And we were fortunate. There's a great element of luck in this research story that the corner post also had that bark edge, that exterior piece of the tree, so that we could get the actual date, its last ring. We knew we had its last ring. Okay, so what did we get from that? We got that 1818 date again. So that was our real cornerstone moment. And we said that this main portion, that's that white portion of the house, dated to the latest date, which would be the harvest of the latest harvest of wood for it, was that winter of 1817, 1818, which is, quite markedly not 1799. And we have a sequence for the rest of the house as well, which is less central to the story, but helps us to understand what we interpret. And so this is the house we're talking about as being from 1818. This part, our dendrochronology, confirmed what we had already observed macroscopically here with these curved saw marks on the beams in that part of the ceiling, that part of the roof, was that these circular saw marks show a technique of sawing of wood that wasn't present in this part of Virginia structurally until the 1850s. So we already knew that, and dendrochronology confirmed it. It fit nicely. All right, and so that room we'd already been reinterpreting. And here we are with an 1818 date for a house that was meant to be 1799, right? And this is a letter from Monroe to his son-in-law, George Hay. And I've bracketed the phrase, I have a new house. All right, and he says, I have a new house with 2 rooms framed just below the present one for lodgers. And he goes on to talk about it will be closed in while here and finished before our return. And he, in fact, then names the enslaved men who did the work to build the house. And the date on this, you don't get this lucky very often, September 6, 1818, which fits very neatly with that 1818 tree ring date, okay? It's an unusually nice story that fits together incredibly well. So House for Lodgers, what's that? James Monroe was president, okay? He was elected 200 years ago this presidential election season and took office in early March of 1817. So 1818 was his first full calendar year of being president, and he was working on several projects, some at his Loudoun County plantation, Oak Hill, up there by Aldie, Virginia. Anybody knows that area? Not too far from Middleburg. You're familiar with it? Yeah, it's a beautiful part of the state. And his house there is gorgeous, and he was redecorating and fancifying and making really nice Oak Hill. And he was also converting rooms here to make more guest rooms, and then it seems building a new house for guests, for people who were maybe coming with him in his presidential travels when he retreated to Albemarle County every once in a while as president, and when perhaps people were coming to visit him, either traveling with or visiting him while here. So it's our presidential guest house, is this standing house. So what does that mean for what we found in the ground, right? It means that that 1885 newspaper account was wrong, that the piece of it wasn't remaining. It was a different building that remained, and that the whole of the Monroe main house, those 2 wings, were both destroyed, presumably by fire. The best I can do in terms of dates so far is to say that I think it must have been between the mid-1830s, judging from the sales of the property, Monroe's death in 1831, its lack of mention in any historic documents that we can find, and between the 1830s and the mid-1850s, perhaps the early 1850s, because that addition on the 1818 House for Lodgers was put on in the mid-1850s. And so I think the addition was making up for the fact that there was only this small house left on the property. All right, so we have excavated another season in the spring of 2016 and continued to expose the foundations. This, I believe, is the joint or the joining part of the 2 wings that we saw on those insurance documents. We've seen a corner here in that's the northeast corner. And we see some of the wall here that is part of that joint between the 2. There's that corner and between the 2 parts of the house. And so this is the basic outline as we understand it, guided heavily by those insurance documents, and then confirmed by our excavation. Each of the black squares is one of the places we've excavated, and you can see the green being where we've confirmed the foundation, the red being the chimney base that I've pointed out a couple times. A couple of places the wall is robbed out and the stones are missing or partially missing because nice quarried stone, if you have it there and you're building something, it's so much easier just to reuse rather than to quarry for new. And so right now we are interpreting this 1799 house site, right? Because it's the whole of the 1799 house. It's not a wing of it as we were looking for. It is the house. It is Monroe's main house, and it was lost, and now it's found. And there's a lot ahead of us in terms of of research, of excavation and interpretation. And the real point of these surface stones now is to point out to our guests, our visitors who come, this is where the house was and this is its scope. It is significantly larger than the little 1818 guest house. And by being larger and more spacious and very likely with more gracious finishes, this allows us to re-examine James Monroe. We started out by saying that one of my main tasks was to make Monroe better known and more well understood. Well, it's time for us to say, okay, what did we think we knew about him, right? Living in a modest house, maybe not terribly socially or politically ambitious, living within his means. But now we are looking at a house that's 70 feet long and 34 feet wide. That's a pretty significant footprint. And it's time for us to re-examine Monroe and think about the sort of arc of his life and what he contributed historically and what his own ambition may have been. And so the stones help us to visualize that, and they're simply a marker until we can more fully excavate. All right, if I could spend just a few more minutes, I don't want you to go away from this discussion thinking that Monroe lived in a vacuum or lived by himself. The plantation was home to a varying number of enslaved African Americans who worked the fields, tended crops, served the family, cooked the food, and all those tasks. And there's one reconstructed quarter here that was rebuilt in the 1980s. And we don't know much else about the physical location for enslaved people's lives on the property. There is a scatter of artifacts that was identified some 20 years ago or so that we have been investigating. And I suspect that this scatter of artifacts belongs to another building on what may have been a row of buildings here. It is now truncated by this road, and our excavation has shown that that's a more recent road. And so what we're doing really is opening up our understanding of the landscape and looking at where more people would have lived and worked. And so this is as essential a part of our research and our interpretation as is the main house, and is going on simultaneously. Kyle Edwards here is a PhD student in anthropology here at UVA, and here he is during his excavation this spring. I'm looking at the stratigraphy there, I'm looking at the layers, and again, this is the road that was post-Monroe, and that later truncated that service yard. All right, and so these things are becoming a part of our narratives that we tell about the property, about Monroe himself, and about this period in US history. And it is an always evolving story, because there's always something new, and as long as we keep researching and keep asking and answering new questions, we will always change what we say and what we can present to the public. So the story about the property will evolve, and the story about Monroe himself will also evolve, and I hope that in 5 years and in 10 years he's much better understood. So at this point I would like to invite questions or discussion, whether it's about the work itself or my angle on it or any of those other pieces. Yes? Right, that's a very good question. You know, I showed those points where that old archaeology report said dig here, here, and here. We did start there, but really what we did was we dug 360 degrees around that standing house, so that we dug in all places. One of the things that we believe in firmly as archaeologists is that you shouldn't dig just where you think you're going to find something, because that just validates your assumptions. You should dig sort of in a blanket way to where you think you're going to find something and where you sort of have no idea. And quite often something surprises you. And in fact, this surprised us. That was not where I would have said, you know, a missing main house would be located. I would have put it up on the hill. I would have imagined that. So yeah, that's what we do. And so don't validate your own assumptions. That's a key piece of scientific research. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is there a certain depth that you dig?
Yeah, absolutely. We, as a rule of thumb, dig down beneath the layers that have been disturbed by human behavior. In many places, that's plowing, and so that's sort of between 3/4 of a foot and 1.25 feet, so average about a foot. And when we get below that, what we find is the very solid red clay here. And I know for those of you who may be fairly new to Central Virginia, I think back to when I first came here and I started running a crew in the field. They'd been already active for a month or so before I got there. And I said, okay, so how do you know when to stop? Sort of the same question, And they said to me, oh, well, we stop when we hit red clay. And I just laughed because, of course, it all looks like red clay when you're newly introduced to our ground here. But it's redder and clayier. It's more solid, and it's very waxy and very specific to the weathered in place, sort of over really long periods of time, developed soil. And once you get into that, no more human behavior below that. That's when you stop. Yeah.
When a new surprising thing comes up that has lots of open questions, is it exciting and are you glad for it, or is it kind of frustrating?
Oh, it's very exciting. Yeah, I can think of nothing better than to have to make Nancy work really hard and retrain everybody for a whole new set of information. But she does a great job in it, and so it really does well. Yes, we don't know everything there is to know about history. Nancy tells me regularly enough so that I remember it, that history is a set of narratives based on the evidence available at the time, right? And you add more evidence and you have to change your narratives. And to me, there's nothing better. Like, we thought we knew this. We've been saying this for 130 years, and look, it's different now. Let's think about what else we've misunderstood or misinterpreted. And that's really the key piece and the most interesting piece. And if I didn't think I would find something that surprised me, I wouldn't bother doing research. So it's great. And I will also say, if you don't mind a long answer to a short question, if you put yourselves, and I know that probably in your professional lives, this is a reach, but put yourselves in my position as an administrator or as in charge of a historic site, okay? And during this research process, I was faced with questions about the veracity of the actual thing we were interpreting, right? Like, this might not be James Monroe's house. We've been selling tickets to this for a long time. What does that mean? And so, as a researcher, I'm like, great, that's awesome. We can, turn on our heads. As an administrator, I was like, this might be a little awkward. And so the steps that I went through, and the one I am eternally grateful for, and I could wake up every single morning and think about this and be grateful, is that the leadership team that I have, my 2 advisory boards, said to me, yes, Sara, we need to do this research. We need to find out the truth. Okay? They were not afraid. They said, whatever we find out, we will deal with it. Okay? If we've been wrong the whole time, we need to stop being wrong. Okay? And that is a courageous thing that not everybody is able to do. And it was because of the backing of these advisory teams, which are important to William and Mary, that I was allowed to forge ahead and pull those dendrochronology samples, right? When we got really suspicious of that standing house, we knew that if we pulled those samples, we could find something really awkward. Not a wonderful presidential guest cottage, but something that some farmer built after Monroe sold the property, right? I mean, it could have been really scary. But we're very fortunate that not only is it there, we know its date, we know a letter Monroe wrote about it, we know the names of the enslaved men who did the work. So all's well that ends well, but I will not kid you, there were some tense moments behind closed doors when we really were faced with, yes, this could be real. And it's these moments that are defining and important and really exciting. And so, I don't know, if I didn't come to give you advice, but if I was going to give you advice, I'd say go ahead and be courageous. Yeah. So.
And if I might also chime in with a nod to Brown College, it was Sasha, a Brown College student, who bears the distinction of being the first new guide to be trained to give just the new tour of Highland. So, go Brown College.
Thank you.
Yes?
Were there any restrictions in getting the wood samples?
No.
Short answer.
Yes, I'm thinking through all the things I should have done, and I think I'm all right. No, the advisory board, you know, I definitely consulted with them before I did it, and they, you know, on behalf of William and Mary, advised me to go ahead. Certainly before doing archaeology, there's state permitting required. And so we've gone through a process of applying for a permit to excavate on state lands, which involves certain restrictions and reporting. And so we fulfill those regularly when we do that. But I hope that I was right, but my answer is no. Yes?
You mentioned the dependencies. When were they built?
That's a really good question. I think that the smokehouse, which was the one to the north, the one on the right in the picture with the little pyramidal roof, was probably the earliest building on the property. The dependency, the slave quarter that was reconstructed in the 1980s, I think that it, I don't know. I think maybe the building that it replicated was post-Monroe, but that there was a Monroe era building there, and I don't have a date for that. And the overseer's house, which is the one to the south in that line, probably was, you know, roughly 1800, but it could be a decade before, a decade later. So I don't have really good dates on that. When I first started out with the dendrochronology, the plan and scope of work was to do both the main house and the overseer's house. But the main house got so interesting and complicated, we had to use our second phase on that one. So that's still pending. Yeah, so stay tuned. More news. I don't know what I have up my sleeve next. I don't have any suspicions, but you know, archaeology research, you don't know what you're going to find. So
Let's give a round of applause. Thank you very much. Absolutely terrific.